Welcome to the Nantucket GAM, a podcast from the Nantucket Historical Association.
Join us as we take you on a journey through time,
where we'll tell stories of Nantucket's past and talk with those helping shape its future.
I'm Annalie Gilbert-Keith, and I'm joined today by Thomas Parrish.
Hello.
And Adam DeLogue.
Hi.
We are members of the Visitor Operations team at the Nantucket Historical Association. In each episode, one of us will go on a research blitz, pulling facts and stories out of the archives to explore the fascinating history of our island. Then we'll invite a guest to join our GAM to understand how the past continues to shape the modern history and future of the island. This month, we're talking about fire. We'll build up to the fateful Great Fire of 1846, and along the way, we'll see stories of community collaboration, histories of explosive new ideas, and tales of easily avoidable tragedy. Later in this show, we will be joined by Fire Captain Nate Barber, who will talk about firefighting on Nantucket today, and perhaps the most significant fire in recent memory, the Veranda House fire of 2022.
The people that came down there that day made a difference, all of them. It was special. And it was really special for the Nantucket Fire Department. I think a lot of us that were there that day looked back and knew that we did our job.
This is the Nantucket GAM. Thomas, can you set the scene for us? What did Nantucket look like in the 1830s and 40s?
You have to imagine a town that looks different from what it does today. In the 1830s and 40s, Nantucket is a working town. It's one of the leading whaling capitals of the world. But like many towns in New England, there's a few brick buildings, but it's predominantly wood, and the buildings are pretty close together. It's an industrial hub for whaling. Whale oil is being offloaded from these ships.
On Nantucket, with everything being built out of wood and oil being sort of the primary product that's coming in and out, that sounds like a really good recipe for a big fire. Did they have any precautions in place? Were Nantucketers sort of aware of that risk?
So being predominantly wooden structures close together, that gives many communities in New England an increased risk of fire, right? But Nantucket is especially at risk for fire because whaling is the economic legs of the island. It's what the island's built upon economically. And whale oil, it's valuable because it burns so well, right? And so it increases the risk of fire on Nantucket in a relatively unique way. And there are steps taken, right? You have fire engines brought to the island pretty early. Ultimately, by the time of these fires we're going to discuss momentarily, there's 10 different fire companies on the island, and the town actually invests in building cisterns underneath the roads in town, so you have this ready supply of water for these fire companies and fire engines to use to propel on fires. You also have fire watchers in the church steeples at night, so you have people actively looking out for fires to shout out to the fire companies, send cries of fire, alerting the fire companies to come to town to fight it.
So it sounds like there is actually like an infrastructure, firefighting infrastructure.
There is. Fire was a real acknowledged risk on Nantucket. Like I said, it's especially at risk with this high volume of flammable whale oil on Nantucket.
Something I noticed also is just that you refer to them as fire companies rather than departments. Can you explain a little bit if there's a difference?
There is. So these are mostly independent organizations. They aren't known for working together very well. This will prove fateful, as we'll see later on in the story. But these fire companies are mostly fraternal groups. There's more of a social club in which groups of men would coordinate together. But there was a lot of pride in the fire company. They had their unique emblems, and they were centered around the what they called a tub, or the fire engine. That was the affectionate term for these fire engines, was the tub. And there was a sense of fraternal identity in these groups.
So it's more like, something to do with your buddies on the weekend. Fight fires, get a drink.
Well, I think firefighting became the secondary activity. It was hang out, train, and then if you had to fight a fire, you would.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So a follow-up is, I'm wondering what a fire engine looked like in the 1830s and 40s. I'm going to guess it's not sort of the truck that we're familiar with now.
No, notably there's no motor. And so you would actually pull these fire engines by hand. And so we have these photos of men pulling ropes, like horses would pull ropes of this carriage and pulling it through the cobblestone streets. But they also function in a similar way in the sense that they would take water and project it on fires like we see today.
So these fire companies, these social clubs, what is a good example of firefighting that you've researched?
I think the first notable example of a I won't say calamitous, but well, one of the best examples that I've seen is in 1836. On May 10th, about 10 o'clock at night, the Washington House, which was a pretty substantial hotel, one of the most notable hotels in the 1830s. Keep in mind, this is before tourism really takes off. So you don't have the big hotels yet. But it was substantial enough that John Quincy Adams actually came to Nantucket and stayed in the Washington House just a year prior. But it went up in a chimney fire, and the building itself went up pretty quickly. Cries of fires rang out, and the fire companies arrived, and they start fighting the fire. But we have a lithograph of this moment that was published in the newspaper, and you see 3 prongs of attack. You have the fire company, that's number 1. They hook up to the cistern, and they start projecting water through the pumping of these breaks up and down, spraying water on the Washington House and the surrounding buildings as well to douse them, to keep it from spreading. But you also have 2 other prongs of attack. You have citizens, and the citizens come down into town, and they make a bucket brigade, and they're carrying water in the lithograph from the cistern, hand by hand, to project on buildings to, again, prevent, in this case, the fire from spreading onto other buildings. It's not trying to put out the fire, it's too big at this point. And the third prong is that other citizens and members of the fire company were going into buildings that were at risk and removing valuables.
So it sounds like the fire companies are bringing these engines and using the engines to fight the fire, but the citizens that are responding are equally as important in fighting this fire in 1836.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And actually in the newspapers afterward, they really applaud the teamwork between the fire companies and the citizens downtown. Afterwards, they would write, "Every man, woman, and child present on the occasion seemed actuated by a single impulse, and to feel a joint and equal interest in the catastrophe."
So women and children were fighting the fire too. It's not just, the men on the fire companies and their friends who aren't part of the company. It's everybody.
And are they also pictured in this this lithograph, this picture that we have?
Actually, they're not. In the lithograph, it's only men wearing exactly the same top hat and suit, which I also find a little bit unbelievable that everyone was well-dressed to fight this fire at this point by 11:30. In the lithograph, it is just men fighting it. But we know that there were women involved. Another quote from the local newspaper reads, quote, "Hundreds of ladies stationed voluntarily in the lines, forgetting all personal hazard and laboring like storm-distressed mariners." Which, if you think about it, has to be some of the highest praise. This is a maritime community, made their money off of traveling the world on ships. Storm-distressed mariners is a pretty high compliment.
It also doesn't particularly invoke the image of hats and suits. If I'm thinking of a mariner, they're not dressing nicely.
No, I think that there was maybe a little bit of artistic liberty in the dress in that lithograph.
You never know. A night out on the town, you've got your hat and your suit, and then there's a fire. You and your friends have to go put it out. You don't have time to change.
No, you don't. It's true.
No, I guess it's probably they were trying to put a best foot forward. This is how Nantucket fights their fires.
Well, there was a sense of pride afterwards. A lot of the newspapers, one of the major things that they write about is that it wasn't worse. Right? This is the first major fire in town. The Washington House, one of the most notable hotels on island, is burned to ashes. A few other buildings were taken with it. But the takeaway in the newspapers really seemed to be that to successfully fight fires, the citizens and fire companies worked together and it would work.
It's very it's a populist approach at fighting fires as a community, arm in arm.
It makes sense, though. I mean, if you're at a location that's on fire, suddenly respond,
And there is a sense of community on Nantucket. It's a small community, right? And so it is part of your responsibility as a Nantucketer to prevent fire from spreading.
Given that they were proud of their response, it wasn't worse than it was, and there's sort of this, community effort to work together to prevent fires from happening, did they feel comfortable moving forward saying, yay, we contained this fire, or did they start trying to figure out new ways or better ways to contain fires in the future?
They were proud of the fact that they kept the fire from spreading further, but there was also a recognition that it could have spread. In this environment of wooden structures in the town of Nantucket, the greatest risk was the spread of fire from building to building. When one building catches, the next one goes up, and the one after that, and that's how you really are at risk of a major fire. And so they did take measures to try new techniques, and the most notable one was the creation of fire breaks.
How does one create a fire break?
Well, you remove one of the buildings. You break that chain of fires, right? And you do that through gunpowder. And so after 1836, the town has a new idea to test if gunpowder can create fire breaks in an urban environment. And they do that by testing it on an old rundown windmill that's out of commission called Bunker Mill. So they put a keg of gunpowder in the base of the mill, they light the fuse, and they see what happens. Well, I'll give you a wild guess. It blows up.
Would that not start a fire itself?
It doesn't, because it's so quick. It destroys the building, renders it to rubble, but none of the wood is able to catch fire. This rubble is no longer a major threat to spread the fire to the next building.
Is Bunker Mill, this mill that you're talking about, is it about the same size as the mill that we have now?
It would have resembled the old mill today in certain degrees.
Wow.
And also, just as someone who loves history and who loves the old mill, it's also just painful to imagine blowing it up. Like, it is decrepit, it's worn down, it's not being used as much. But can you imagine someone blowing up the old mill today? Like, it just hurts my heart a little bit.
It would not go over well.
No. So, in 1838, just 2 years after the Washington House burned down, there's another fire in town. This one starts behind Union Street, and it started in a rope walk owned by a man named Joseph James.
What's a rope walk?
A rope walk is a low, long building that was used to twist typically hemp into rope. Keep in mind, again, Nantucket's a maritime economy, and these whaling ships would have, it's not an exaggeration, miles of rope. And so some of that rope was made on Nantucket, including in rope walks owned by Joseph James.
And are rope walks especially flammable?
They are. So as you're working that hemp, you get hemp dust. And that hemp dust is very flammable. On top of that, some of the ropes use tar to weatherproof them. And this tar has to be warmed. You're not doing that with an electric stove today. You're doing it with fire. And so rope walks are notorious in history for starting fires as that flame catches the hemp dust and it goes up quickly. One of the major fires in Boston was actually started in a rope walk as well.
So once this rope walk caught on fire, it spread to the rest of the town, I assume?
It was not a good night. It started at 2 a.m. And so one of the major problems was that this community effort that was so applauded, that was so praised in 1936, just 2 years earlier, it couldn't be raised. People were asleep. These oil factories that had these casks of very profitable whale oil, well, when they catch in the oil sheds and candle factories, these casks burst as they burn. And they send streams and rivers of what the newspaper called lava-like fires flowing through the streets. It spread the fire even further, and because oil is lighter than water, it settled on the surface, and the whole harbor itself was alight.
Almost sounds like a scene out of Dante's Inferno.
No, it really does. And on top of it, it also settled in the marshes and the low-lying grasslands near Union Street, where the rope walk was, and it created these curtains of fire. And the newspaper would write, it, quote, presented a most awful, magnificent spectacle as it burned in the marshes. And there was so much oil that afterwards, they actually came back after the fire went out and scooped the oil out of the marshes to bring back to the candle factories to refine and sell because it was so valuable. And there was so much of it that they could do that. Well, one newspaper cited it was somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 barrels of oil that was lost that night.
That's a huge financial loss for the town, too.
It's truly a disgusting amount of oil to think about, I think. I mean, imagine if that was, say, Jell-O. Do you know how much Jell-O you would have to spill into a marsh to be able to scoop Jell-O back out of the marsh later and reuse it? A lot of Jell-O. So did they end up using any of this gunpowder? Did they create fire blocks during this fire?
They did, and it was actually seen as one of the greatest successes of that night. Many theories, of course, in the fact that 20 to 30 buildings were lost, but the newspaper would cite the effectual use of gunpowder very specifically as the reason the fire did not spread further. One example of this is C. Mitchell & Co. Was at risk of being burned down, and gunpowder is cited as saving that specific oil warehouse. If that building caught, the oil inside of that warehouse would have been lost and spread the fire even further as well. So that's one example of seeing the success of gunpowder in creating those fire breaks. And so while in 1836, we see the fact that citizen efforts applauded alongside the fire company, and we see that citizen and fire company response in of itself is not sufficient. Gunpowder can be a substantial defense mechanism to keep fire from spreading further.
So when in doubt, just start blowing things up.
Well, you're joking, but yeah. Let's visualize this for a moment, because you have these lava-like rivers of burning whale oil flowing through the streets of Nantucket. You have the booms of gunpowder exploding in the night as 6 different buildings are intentionally blown up. You have the harbor literally alight. This, by all accounts, should have been the Great Fire of Nantucket. It would have been such an awful calamity that night.
So given how awful this fire was, but also the success of gunpowder, how did Nantucket react to that? Did people sort of feel more comfortable knowing that gunpowder worked?
They saw gunpowder as a successful solution. Boston would actually cite the successful use of gunpowder on Nantucket when they used gunpowder themselves during one of their great fires. But there was also a realization that this was not ideal and that certain things had failed. For example, after the fire, there was recognition that the fire companies were not sufficient to fight this fire. And so one of the changes that came out of this fire was that they increased the store of gunpowder available for potential fires in the future, and they consolidated the fire departments more under the town and channeled certain funding from the town, not a huge amount, but some, to the fire companies to help them prepare for a fire in the future as well.
Did anybody think, though, that they would really have to do that again?
No. And I'm going to read you a quote from Episcopal Reverend Moses Marcus that reads, quote, "I trust a similar catastrophe will never happen again, nor do indeed I think it can. For witnessing as I did the unwearied efforts of the fire department and the effectual application of gunpowder, I must say that under God, we have a very reasonable ground of confidence no fire can ever become so extensive or so alarmingly destructive."
If you visited the Whaling Museum, though, you may notice that we're talking about 1838, but what you usually hear people at the Nantucket Historical Association talk about is the Great Fire of 1846.
So our friend, the Reverend, sort of jinxed us here.
I think he did, yes. 1846, only 8 years later, would dwarf this fire.
How did it start?
Well, let's set the stage. It's July 13th in 1846. It's the middle of summer, so there's a southerly breeze blowing. It would have been a beautiful summer night. On Main Street, William Gary's hat shop starts having smoke billow out of it.
That's not ideal.
It's not ideal. And so cries of fire ring out through the night, and very quickly, the fire in William Gary's hat shop continues to build, but soon after, 2 fire companies arrived on the scene.
Now, did these companies know what had happened?
It was a relatively small fire at first, but it was clear there was a fire. A witness to this fire, William Macy, who was standing on the top of Main Street, was now the Pacific National Bank, would later write, quote, "A stream of water could have quenched the fire."
So if a stream of water could have quenched the fire, how did this go so wrong?
Well, this small fire in William Gary's hat shop was too far for a single engine to put out and reach the cistern. And so the logical solution was just to link the 2 fire engines together, 2 fire companies work together, but evidently that didn't happen because we're talking about it today. And so I want to go back to the beginning of this conversation where we talked about these individual fire companies, and that there was a sense of pride in each of these organizations. There was a sense of pride in representing your fire company. And this violently came into play this night because the engine pumping water from the cistern to the other engine was seen as an inglorious task, right? The pride of using your tub is to fight the fire. So one engine will be delegated to the inglorious task of pumping water into the other engine, what was called playing water into the other engine. But neither one wanted to give way. And so these two companies start arguing in the street. By some accounts, they start physically fighting. And so you have this moment where instead of fighting the fire, they start fighting each other.
Seems like a poor recipe for fighting a fire.
Yes. In the official report from the fire department, this moment is specifically cited as the beginning of the Great Fire of 1846, because as they are not fighting the fire only continues to grow and grow and grow until the fire in this building starts spreading to the building next to it, and eventually it jumps across Main Street to another block.
Emotions got in the way.
Humanity is the X factor in this situation.
So at what point did they stop fighting each other, and what did they do when they turn around and this fire had grown by a lot?
Well, eventually one of them gives way. History seems to have lost which one gave way and took what was called the, quote, inglorious task. But ultimately they do stop fighting the fire, but at this point it's too late. The fire was already out of control. And because it was dry, it hasn't rained in weeks, and there was a wind that night, cries of fire stopped being heard from other places in town. This fire isn't just jumping building to building. There's other fires popping up around town. This makes it harder to contain. All 10 fire companies on Nantucket are summoned to this fire.
So do they end up using the gunpowder that they've saved up?
They do. Ultimately, over the course of the night, 30 different buildings were blown up.
Which, if I remember correctly, was the number of buildings in total that were destroyed in 1838.
Exactly. Exactly. So they intentionally blew up the same number of buildings that were destroyed in total in what probably should have been the Great Fire of Nantucket. One of the first things that they aimed to save is the Athenaeum. The Athenaeum is in the heart of town. It's only about 2 blocks away from where this fire started. But the fire was spreading in that direction with the southerly wind. And the Athenaeum's both a library like it is today, but it's also a repository of historic documents, and some artifacts have been brought back by whalers. So it's this multifaceted building, but also has a lot of emotional value as a community center to Nantucket. And so they really want to save this building. But there's only 2 buildings that could potentially be destroyed to create a fire break. One of them's another hotel. Right, we already lost the Washington House, so they don't want to blow up the other major hotel, or one of the other major hotels. And so the role and the responsibility to destroy one of the buildings falls to the home of David Gorham Hussey. And the man who's put in charge of all that gunpowder that night is Obed Swain. And unfortunately, Obed Swain and David Gorham Hussey are good friends. You have the fire growing on Main Street. Obed Swain knocks on the door of his friend David G. Hussey and says, "Hey, I need to blow up your house."
It would be wild to be a fly on the wall for that conversation.
I can't even imagine, like, how do you frame that? Like, hey, bud, hey, friend.
Well, you just say, hey, look, Thomas, I just really need to blow up your house. You've got 5 minutes, grab as much as you can, and then I'm just going to, not a big deal.
It is a big deal, right? You're losing your home.
I kid, of course. But, I think that, it must have been a really emotional conversation, you would imagine.
It can only be a tough conversation. There's no easy way. Right now, there's many routes you could go. You could appeal to him as a Nantucketer and say we're trying to save the Athenaeum. He could have invoked the fire law of 1797 to be like, hey, I can destroy property in the event of a fire and claim a legal case, but I'm not sure how well that's going to work in this high-stress situation. But ultimately, David G. Hussey relents. And in exchange, Obed Swain, as a friend, goes into his home and starts collecting his belongings, helping him remove all the valuables and bringing them outside and carrying them away from the fire. Well, eventually the fire is growing and they have to blow the building. So Obed Swain goes outside, he gets the keg of gunpowder, puts it in the house, gives the final shout to clear the house, and he goes to light the fuse. But where's David G. Hussey? He hasn't seen him leave. So he makes one last check. And he does it because he knows David G. Hussey is hard of hearing. And because Obed Swain and David G. Hussey are friends, he knows this about him, and he makes one final check, goes upstairs, and sees his friend still removing valuables upstairs. Brings him outside, ultimately saving his life, and lights the fuse and blows up his house.
That's a really close call.
It's a very close call. If it had been anyone else that night who didn't know David G. Hussey, he would have been blown up that night because they wouldn't have known he was hard of hearing and didn't hear the shouts to clear the house.
Were there any casualties that night?
David G. Hussey is one of the closest. The man who recorded that history for us, Christopher Hussey, would also carry a woman out of a burning house. So there's close calls, but miraculously, not a single person lost their life that night.
And yet, it is the Great Fire of 1846, as recorded by many on the island. What was the damage?
By the night's end, when sun came up the next morning, 360 buildings were destroyed. It's about a third of the town. Now, keep in context, there's not much else on Nantucket. There's not much outside of the town. So 1/3 of the town is a huge hit to the community of Nantucket. And on top of that, it's mostly the economic and industrial center. So it's mostly the infrastructure that supports whaling. And all of that is burned to ash. I mean, quite literally to ash. Only the chimneys were still standing.
So these Nantucketers have lost everything.
They lost a lot. $1 million in damage. It's $1 million in 1846, not today's money, 1846 dollar. But it also took a huge personal toll. Dozens of Nantucket families, hundreds of Nantucketers lost possessions, lost their homes, lost their businesses. In the immediate aftermath, the Nantucket Selectmen published a circular that went out to the mainland that read, quote, "We are in deep trouble. We cannot of ourselves relieve the whole distress, and we are compelled to call upon those who have not been visited like ourselves for aid in this hour of extreme necessity."
So in a way, you always have the civilian response, the citizen response to fires, because, I mean, it used to be maybe the bucket brigade, but still here you have people asking for help rebuilding and recovering from the fire.
Community coming together.
Yeah.
It's true. And Nantucket's a maritime economy, right? So people leave on the boats, they establish communities elsewhere, but you retain these Nantucket connections. This community response, like you mentioned, becomes larger than just Nantucket, extends to the communities on the mainland. And ultimately, only 6 months after the Great Fire, they follow up the circular with another that reads, "Your bounty has been large and well-timed. About $6,400 worth of provisions, clothing, furniture, and dry goods have been received, and $56,498 in money." This is a huge influx of aid. And ultimately, this would help, according to the selectmen, 1,350 people. So it is helping people get back on their feet.
So returning to these other stories that we have of these 3 big fires, in the first fire that we talked about in 1836, there's the civilian response, and that sort of helps keep the fire somewhat contained. They're lucky it wasn't worse, and that led them to the use of gunpowder, which was effective in 1838. Was there a lesson in 1846 or a good takeaway? Because it sounds right now like it was just pretty bad.
It was bad, and the takeaway seemed not to be the advancement of firefighting technology. They realized that instead of changing the techniques, they have to change the town. And so immediately following the Great Fire of 1846, they widened streets, make it more difficult for fire to jump again. This notably happened on Center Street, but most famously on Main Street, that big wide street that you see on many of the postcards of Nantucket. That big wide street, which is, I believe, the widest street on Nantucket, was created after the Great Fire of 1846 to keep a fire from jumping over like it did at the start of this fire.
That actually explains a lot. You know, I never knew why that street had been so large. I mean, for somebody coming in off island, it looks strange, especially if there's no cars parked on either side. The street's about 4 lanes wide.
So in kind of a big way, the fire of 1846 created the town that we all know.
In many ways, the Great Fire is the beginning of the end of one period of Nantucket history and the start of another. 1846 is often seen as the acceleration of the decline of Nantucket whaling, which sets the stage for the rise of Nantucket tourism. And it's that tourism that is a longer-lasting, more impactful economy than whaling ever was to Nantucket, and it maintains this image of the historical view of Nantucket. And the Great Fire is, in many ways, the beginning of this transition to the footprint and vision of Nantucket that we see today. Set the stage for it.
So we have explored all of these different takeaways from these 3 big fires in Nantucket. The need for firefighting and evolving techniques on Nantucket hasn't changed at all. You still see that with the Veranda House fire a few years ago. And so after this break, we'll also be talking with Nate Barber, who is a firefighter here on Nantucket, about the continued evolution of firefighting on the island.
Hi, I'm Isaiah from the Nantucket Historical Association. Do you enjoy listening to the Nantucket GAM? Experience more Nantucket history by joining as a member of the Nantucket Historical Association today. Take advantage of free admission to the museum and historic sites, discounts on programs and decorative arts workshops, and receive a copy of our magazine Historic Nantucket delivered to your mailbox 3 times a year, among many other amazing perks. Learn more and join today at nha.org.
Welcome back. I'm Thomas Parrish. I'm joined now by Nate Barber, who's a captain of the Nantucket Fire Department. Welcome to the Nantucket GAM.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Our listeners may recognize your name, or that, if you don't mind me saying, iconic mustache of yours, from 2022 when you really became the face of the effort to save the Veranda House. In the process, you received several awards or commendations from both on and off island, including Nantucket's Person of the Year in 2022. You received the Medal of Valor Award at the Massachusetts Firefighter of the Year Awards. You received the Egan Maritime Lifesaving Award, and you even received a special congressional commendation. But of course, you did not fight that fire alone. You had your colleagues at the fire department at your side, which included your brother. And so today I want to dive into your experience as a firefighter in Nantucket, how it relates to the stories of firefighting we saw in the 19th century, and discuss your own experience at the Veranda House, one of Nantucket's most recent historic fires. So thanks for being here.
Great. Thanks for having me.
So first, I just want to ask, have you heard about or are you aware of some of these 19th century fires? Have you heard about the Great Fire of 1846? Is that part of the ethos of the contemporary fire department?
I have heard of it. We actually have a mural of the Great Fire in our firehouse that was painted by a local artist, Chris Bonelli. So, I see a painting of it every day I go to work.
Is it something that you talk about with other firefighters?
We have talked about it before, but I don't think it's a regular. It's not like we train on techniques from 1846.
No, of course not.
But
I want to back up a little bit. What inspired you to be a firefighter? Was this something that you looked to when you were younger, or was it something that you fell into?
No, I don't think I really grew up wanting to be a firefighter. I found myself at 26 years old, and I needed to find a steady job. And I had a girlfriend I was trying to impress at the time who became my wife, and I think I needed some health insurance to maybe lure her in or something like that. And then I really enjoyed it it was a great way to meet people and help people in the community and forge friendships. I mean, most of my best friends are firefighters, and a lot of people I know in the community are because I work at the Nantucket Fire Department.
In the 19th century, we talk about how there's this real sense of fraternity amongst the fire companies, that there's this real, it's almost like a social group that fights fire versus a full-time dedicated firefighting force. Do you still see that pride and fraternal connection amongst the men and women in the fire department today?
Absolutely. I've always kind of described it as it's like an adult sleepover. And, we show up and we work during the day and get things ready. And then, we have a meal and we enjoy times together and maybe watch a movie together or go on some calls or do some things together that are kind of exciting and kind of scary. You're really forging bonds with people, and they're your friends, but they're also people you rely on in certain situations that you really need to rely on people. So I'm sure it's like a lot of other maybe military, paramilitary organizations where you kind of go through these exciting times together and you become friends. And
It sounds like you quite literally have to trust them with your life.
You do, and you have to trust them to, hold the other end of the stretcher or, get the pump going. Or there's just a lot of things that you have to depend on them to do, and they do it. And, we make sure that we're looking out for each other, and that's important. What we have is a unique situation where geography lends us to rely on the people that we have. A lot of fire departments in towns in Massachusetts or the rest of the world, they reach out to their neighbors, and the neighbors will respond and help them out. So what we've always had to do is deal with situations on our own, no matter how many people we had, and no matter how many people were here for the summer. When I first started, there was 3 of us.
Wow.
There could be 60,000 people here in the summer, and there'd be 3 firefighters in the station responding to every call.
In 1846, one of the key moments of that fire is, in a large part, when pride gets in the way of duty, when these 2 fire companies are unable to work together because there's this sense of pride and wanting to put out the fire versus just playing water from the cistern into another engine. You talk about the social cohesion of your department. How is that channeled into a productive form of duty versus this moment that gets in the way of duty in 1846?
I don't know exactly what happened in 1846, but I do know that there are people that show up and just want to solve the problem, and they do whatever they can to solve the problem. And there's probably some people that show up and, have a sense of pride that they're running the show, or that they're, do as I say, and want to put on some sort of presence that's maybe not as productive as just putting the fire out. So I don't know what happened. I wasn't there, obviously. But what I've seen throughout my career is, I've seen people that show up and try to just go to work and solve the problem.
When I was researching this episode, I found a lot of references to the nicknames that they gave their fire engines. Tub was a common one in the 19th century. Do you have any good nicknames for the apparatuses today?
I don't. I don't, but maybe we need one. We have one green truck that was given to us through a grant or something, and a couple of guys put some like frog stickers on it or something. But I think that's all I can think of for nicknames.
I do think that when many people on Nantucket think about contemporary fires, the Veranda House fire is one of those that comes to mind. I remember I was working at the old mill that day giving tours, and there was all of this white smoke just sitting across Prospect Hill Cemetery. And it took me until that afternoon to figure out what actually happened. Can we talk about your experience on that day? When did you find out about the fire? Where were you? And what did you do?
That was July 7th of 2022. So that morning, I was giving my wife a ride to her car because she had gone out the night before with her friends, and she left her car in town, and she took an Uber home. And I was driving her to her car, and we decided to stop and have coffee at Nantucket Coffee Roasters.
Downtown?
Yeah, downtown, right on the Strip. And, we both got a coffee. And I was talking to Mrs. Butterworth, who her husband was a doctor here, and her kids went to school with me. And I was looking at the Whaling Museum when I was talking to her, and I saw a black puff of smoke go right over the ridge of the candle factory there. And I thought that was strange. And then another one happened, and just, got the gut feeling that something wasn't right. And so I gave my coffee to my wife, and I started moving there. And then I saw more smoke, and I started running. And as I looked over the right, there was another couple Nantucketers running right next to me. One of them was Pat Marks. And I started running down North Water Street. I started seeing people empty into the street. And I remember thinking at the time, I hope it's not the hotel, because that would be, that would be bad. And then I turned the corner, and it was the hotel. And it was fully on fire when I got there, by the time I got there.
Do you remember how the fire started?
Well, I know how it started. After they reviewed cameras and did an investigation, it was a cigarette.
Wow.
And there was an individual who I believe worked there, and he flicked a cigarette down into an area that was like where they kept trash. And really what it did and why it spread so fast was because the Veranda House had those old wooden decks on the exterior. And the fire started on the outside, old, dried out wood in the summer. And it just went from deck to deck to deck. And so, by the time I got there, from seeing a puff of smoke to one time I turned the corner, it was a very large fire that had obviously started quickly and spread quickly.
And what time did you first notice that first smoke when you were getting your coffee?
It must have been sometime around 7 a.m. It was actually a fortunate time, really, because had that happened at 3 a.m., the response would have been different. The good thing about the time was it was what we call, around shift change. So there was a shift in the station from the night before, ready to respond, and there was a whole nother shift coming to the station. So in a quick period of time, almost half the fire department was able to respond quickly. And that was a fortunate thing for the town of Nantucket. Had that happened at 3 a.m. on a windy night, you may have had a different result.
In that moment, what was going through your mind when you arrived at the fire?
So when I showed up to the fire, there was 2 individuals right outside, and I really ran up to the building to get everybody away. I thought the building was so engulfed in fire that there wasn't a big benefit of just going in blindly. So I just tried to get everybody back, and that was really what my goal was at the time, and to do what we call a 360, which is to go around the whole building and see the whole building from all angles, and to kind of see if people need help or what the situation is, because I knew I was most likely the first person on scene from the fire department. But the individuals, they wouldn't leave the building. And the man who I talked to afterwards, he said his son was inside. He pointed to a room and he said the room number. And when he said that, I felt obligated to go look for him. So I went in the door that's down on the patio there where they had, the breakfast there. And I ran into a very thick black smoke. It was just so dark and so intense that it was untenable for me, because I just didn't have any, no gear, no breathing apparatus. So I didn't think that was going to work out. And I came out, and the man said, again, the son was inside, and he pointed to a room and to a window. And so I went to the patio and I grabbed a little cafe table and I put it up against the building. I stepped on top of it, and then I jumped from the table to the roof. And then I climbed up the roof, and then I got to a dormer that had another roof on it, and I was able to get from one roof to the next. And from there, I opened the window and went inside the building. And on that side of the building, the smoke was not as intense. But then I opened the door to the hallway, and that hallway was pretty smoky. The smoke was right down to almost all the way to the floor. And as I searched around in the hallway a little bit, I heard people. And after I heard people, I yelled to them. And basically out of the darkness of a staircase, there 2 people came out, and I reached down and I helped them up the staircase. And once they got to the top of the staircase, I found a window, and I opened the window, and we went out. We got on top of the porch that was on the other side of the hotel. And then, the problem was that the porch was on fire. So, I started looking around and started wondering what the next step was. And I actually called my brother, because he was on the responding engine, and he didn't pick up the phone.
You called him on your cell phone?
I did, yeah. I figured I was going to call dispatch, but I just figured they were probably getting 1,000 phone calls a second. So, I didn't have a radio or anything, just my cell phone. And then, as I'm trying to figure out how we're going to get down, I wasn't as concerned, because I just, I felt good that we got out of the smoky hotel. So, but, there was a man who I became friends with, Peter Georgiantis. He was running that day, out for a run, and he saw the smoke. I think he saw it from what he told me was like the town pier. That's how far away he
Wow.
was when he saw it. And he said he just beelined it for the hotel. And, it's just one of these like miraculous things, whatever it is, hand of God. I don't know how to explain it, but there just happened to be a guy who ran up and then a ladder on the ground. And he ran up, saw me, put the ladder up, and I helped the two people off the roof. And then got back down, and then he and I actually went back in the hotel. And he was awesome. He was kicking down doors and he was looking for people, and I was with him, and I was pretty exhausted by that point. But
How much time had passed at this point?
maybe 10, 15 minutes. I'm not exactly sure. It was quite a rush of things going on, but we went through the whole hotel that we could access, which was basically that back half, and we checked every room, and we didn't find anybody. But we weren't able to check the old section, and the old section is what was really burning the most. And when I left, I wasn't 100% confident that everybody had gotten out, but everybody got out.
That's pretty miraculous. And one of the things, again, tying it back to the history, that we see as a huge factor in every fire that we've covered is the citizen response of Nantucket, is the people who are at the site when it happens. And if you had not been there, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that the outcome of everyone surviving might have been different. And Peter Georgantis, the fact that he came to the fire and helped out, every fire we covered, you see this Nantucket response of people being willing to come help in these fires.
There was other people too. There was people that showed up and made a ruckus. There was the neighbor. I mean, the neighbor was trying to put the fire out with his garden hose, and which didn't work out, obviously, but he tried.
Better than nothing.
Exactly. And obviously the response from the Nantucket Fire Department was excellent. I think there was only 2 or 3 people that didn't come. There was ex-firefighters and ex-chiefs that came and helped out. There was the response through town. There was people that brought us food. The police obviously helped us out quite a bit. The Nantucket Cottage Hospital sent doctors and nurses down because, we were getting sick as we were there.
From the smoke inhalation?
From the smoke, yeah. So there was quite a great response from Nantucketers all around. And that's important because, we don't have the town next door to come bail us out in 10, 15 minutes. It's going to take hours. So the people that came down there that day made a difference, all of them, not just me. It was special. And it was really special for the Nantucket Fire Department. I think a lot of us that were there that day look back and, knew that we did our job.
It's hard not to draw parallels to this 1836 fire we talked about, where you have the Washington House that goes up in smoke, and other buildings next to it were taken with it, like the Veranda House as well. But you have the fire then companies putting out the fire with the citizen response and ultimately containing it. And you seem to have many parallels to the Veranda House. Ultimately, you are still in your civilian attire, but you don your equipment and continue fighting the fire. How long did it take for the fire department to eventually put out the fire?
So I think we, really started putting flames out 3, 4, 5 hours later. Really, there was such a big fire load on the hotel itself that it took a while to get access to the parts that were on fire. There was a house across the street that caught on fire as well, and we made entry into that building. And it was an old Nantucket house that had balloon framing and a lot of void spaces. So it took a while to chase that. And then there was a building next door to the Veranda House that caught on fire, and that actually flashed over. There was 3 or 4 Nantucket firefighters inside the building, and all the smoke caught on fire while they were inside.
Due to the heat of the fire?
The room gets so hot that the smoke catches on fire. We call it flashover, and it's an extremely dangerous situation, but, the house goes from a smoky house to a house that's fully on fire. And there was people inside that building, firefighters inside that building when that happened. So it took a while to chase the fire through all the nooks and crannies of 18th century houses. But we did it. We got there. And, there was a fire, I think that week in Hingham, and it was a big house. And I think over 100, maybe even over 200 firefighters responded to that. And I think there was like 20 of us that day.
Wow.
And there was 3 buildings on fire.
How do we think about the Veranda House fire? Is it a failure of fire prevention, or should we look at it as a success of firefighting? Because everyone survived. So when you think about this fire and this historic moment, what are your takeaways from that?
I don't see it as a failure in fire prevention, and I've never thought of it that way. What I think about it in terms of large fire is I think of really our history in some regards, and the history of how we construct houses. And Nantucket houses are beautiful. This town is stunning because of our architecture. I really believe that. There are also houses that are made out of wood, and they have wood siding. They have wood frames, and there's some old materials that are probably dried out. There's some maintenance that probably hasn't been done in some regards, and I think it's something that could happen again because, we don't build our houses out of cement, and obviously everywhere you look, there's an old house in Nantucket, especially in the downtown district. So I don't think it's a fire prevention problem. I think it's something that Nantucket always has to be aware of, and the fire department has to be ready for. And so it's important that people obviously, build a code, use smoke detectors, and commercial buildings have fire suppression systems. So I don't see it that way. But I most definitely see that day as a success by the Nantucket Fire Department. And, my role was a small one, really, that day. I mean, we look back at it, and we had a fire chief deputy fire chief at the time named Sean Mitchell. And he's obviously one of my best friends, but he was this incredible leader. And he took command that day. He didn't have an ego. He made us feel like we were doing the right thing. He led everybody that day to a positive result. And, I know Sean, he didn't want to make a big deal about it as him doing the job and the work, but he really did. And, I think he was the biggest hero that day, in my opinion.
You've been on the record saying that the island growth will outmatch the capacity for the fire department to respond. Can you expand on that a little bit?
I think the island's growth, I think it taxes everybody, not just firefighters. Obviously, our schools, our police officers, our infrastructure, our Department of Public Works. We have, fortunately, after the Veranda House, we did add more firefighters, and we needed that. And, that's something that we had been asking for years before that fire. And it was, in that regard, as destructive as that fire was, it was a benefit to the manpower at the fire department because we asked and received more manpower. Right now, my shift has 9 people on it. And through the majority of my career, we had about 5 people, 6 people. So it certainly helps, but we're not the only department in this island that needs more assistance. I mean, my kids go to Nantucket High School. There's always need for more teachers there and more assistance. And the Nantucket Police Department could always need more people, and they have, turnover issues like other departments do. So, the growth on Nantucket has been great for some things, for real estate, for construction, I'm sure, but it also requires more public services.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure to talk to you. It's not every day you get to meet someone who has acted heroically as you have. So thank you for being there on that day, and thank you for continuing to fight fires. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Thomas. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That's it for the Nantucket GAM today. We'll be back next month with a new episode. To see the lithograph we talked about in this episode, and for tips on ways to see surviving evidence of the Great Fire, check out the show notes or head to nha.org. This episode was developed and created by Thomas Parrish, Adam DeLogue, and Annalie Gilbert-Keith. Special thanks to our curator Michael R. Harrison and our Director of Collections and Research Services, Amelia Holmes. Our theme music was composed and performed by Isaiah Williams. Other music in this episode by Blue Dot Sessions. The Nantucket GAM is a production of the Nantucket Historical Association. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thanks for listening.